SCHC, but I also
Recording in progress.
that's kind of a late notice there, but I'm being recorded. So nothing else to report other than it's been working pretty good.
We've got somebody that's on with the phone. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, we're good there, Ray.
Yep. Thank you. So moving on, next is going to be old business, net control operators. We're still looking for net control operators. If you're interested and if you can hit the repeat pretty solid. Somebody have something? Victor?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I did have my hand up for that too. I have a question concerning the repeater endowment fund and repeater upgrades. Given that there are a number of issues around the the quality of the machine, the type of access we may or may not have, that we may or may not desire as an organization, what are we looking at down the road for improvements and changes on our repeaters?
So the board does have a few things that we're working on. We've been working on power supplies and backups to kind of smooth things out. There's also been some work on improving the repeaters. There's a exploration going on right now about a amplifier for the UHF. So there are a few items. The new board, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, may have some additional ideas and directions to go as well. So we will retouch this under new business. Anything else before I move back on? All right, hearing nothing. On the net control operators, if you are interested, we do have training. We have things that we can do to help you set up and get prepared. If you have interest, reach out to myself or any of the board members. We would love to have some additional help with net control operators. Anything else on that before I move on to the next item? Seeing nothing, we will move on to the Arlington Boys and Girls Club. Rob, can you give us an update on that?
Yep, we thanks to Tim and a couple of the others, we actually had a test of the Wi-Fi at the facility, and it does look like it will support hybrid in-person and Zoom meetings. And we also have a copy of the lease agreement that we can get filled out and should have within probably the first couple, 3 days of this coming week, which should cement our ability to get into the facility for a hybrid regular meeting for November. And once we have confirmation of that and the Christmas party date, we'll be able to move forward with those two pieces to wrap out the end of the year. So hopefully we'll be able to actually see some of your smiling faces in person maybe next month.
That is excellent news. Definitely looking forward to getting back to doing some face-to-face, but just to make sure that everybody knows, we will continue with the Zoom as well. There certainly have been a number of people who have been able to join the meetings over Zoom that wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So it is a feature that we desire to keep. So hopefully we will see how that goes and keep our fingers crossed that everything works great with that. Any questions on that before we move on to the next item? I see Steve having his hand up. Go ahead.
Well, just a piece of feedback. I've liked having the meetings on Zoom. A good example, I was in Phoenix, was able to participate in the meeting from down there. So it's really kind of a nice convenience for all of that. So just my 2 cents worth, whatever it's worth.
Yes, I have definitely heard feedback from a number of members that it's a feature that they really like. It's certainly something that as long as I'm president, I'm going to continue to do. The new president will, and new board may have different opinions, but we're going to do our best to encourage them to keep it going on, because it certainly has been a benefit, I think, to our club membership. Anything else before I move on? Seeing nothing, we are going to go into the next item, which I just kind of hinted at, club elections. Dennis, do you want to go over that?
Hello, do you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank
Okay,
you.
sorry, yeah, for getting logged in late here. My problem. So I missed what you said. Did you go over the election results, Ray?
No, that's what I was hoping you would do. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought as president you wanted to announce them, but yes, I'd be glad to. We conducted the election here with Rob's great help using Groups.io, and we just clicked away, and we had 31 people vote, 28 by Groups.io and 3 by email. That all worked. So our new president is Gary Burnett. This list doesn't have names, but it's got call signs. Vice President is Tim Kephart. Treasurer is Randy Mather. Secretary is Ann Garay. And our new director, board is Eric Warden. So that's what's, well, congratulations to all of them. Thank you for volunteering to serve the club, as well as those outgoing members that have served the club for the last year or two. So that's where we're at. We have, if anybody wants to look at the paperwork on the voting, we have that available. And I guess it's a happy moment, pleasant moment. We've elected people, and it's an annual event. Congratulations. And does anybody have any questions?
Woohoo, round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
So just a little background on this. It takes effect in January, but the new members are definitely invited to join into any of the board meetings, etc. It really helps smooth that handoff. So we're looking forward to a large crowd at our next board meeting. Welcome to those new members, and thank you very much for your service to those who have been on the board this year. Thank you guys very much. With that, move on to something that's probably almost as exciting. We are actually going to have a Christmas party this year. It appears, we're keeping our fingers crossed, COVID could go south on us. But if COVID continues in the direction that it's been going, we are able to have a Christmas party, but that means we need a Christmas party coordinator. We are really looking for somebody typically that would have already been working on it. So if you're interested, it's pretty easy. We've got the program down pretty well, but we definitely could use somebody to take over that coordination position. Is there somebody among this group right now that wants to raise their hand and take it on?
I haven't done it before, but I'd be willing to give it a try.
And we would definitely give you plenty of support. Basically just looking for a leadership person. And so Carrie, we would absolutely love that. And do know that we will definitely support you. Oh, somebody sharing
Phyllis,
your
your screen share.
screen.
Phyllis, your screen sharing.
There we go. Now we're back to the regular screen. Thank you. So more on that as we go, but thank you, Carrie, for stepping up for that position. And we're looking forward to working with you on a Christmas party this year, considering that COVID and other things cooperate. future programs. And do you want to talk about some ideas for future programs, or you're probably soliciting ideas?
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, actually, I'd like to hear from members of the club some potential program topics. We've been kind of picking them as the board, and I've picked a few on my own. But if you guys have some ideas, I'd love to hear them. And actually, maybe we could do a couple of ideas right now if people wanted to. And then you can also email me at secretary@wa7law.org. So does anyone have any ideas right now?
Don't everybody speak at once.
Well, if you think of something, you can email me. And also, if anyone would like to give a program, they have a hobby that they, have been really into and would like to share it with the group. We've had a lot of members give programs in the past. John Van Dalen's given programs. This month, we're having Michael Burnette, a member of our club and a member of the board. And anyone can give one. Actually, we're hoping Ed Empey next month is planning to give one on CQ County Hunters. So if he's feeling up to it. And so I'd like to give back to Ray.
Okay, I see a hand up from Victor. Go ahead, Victor.
It might be nice, yes, come on. So it might be nice once in a while to hear from our ARRL, what is it, a zone rep, regional governor or whatever. And I would say, maybe perhaps midterm, so that the the representative has some contact with what's been going on and what we might need to do in a manner to support or object to certain things that are in the environment. Thank you.
It's a great idea.
Now you can do it by Zoom.
Definitely. We'll have to work on inviting them to a Zoom meeting, because that would be great. Steve, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, we used to do that in years past with Mary and Harry Lewis that were the ARRL. I can't think what their titles were, but she would come to the meeting and they would give announcements what was going on and updates, things like that. And it was always pretty informative at that time. So that'd be great if you started doing that again.
That would be our section manager or alternate section manager of Western Washington. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's what it was a section manager. And
Yeah.
I think she was at the time.
Yeah, it's a guy now, but they're still doing the same thing.
Well, I think Mary at the time was very well connected in a lot of different things too. She was also in broadcasting and things of that nature. So I don't know if they would be that connected, but it was informative at the time, but that was like 25, 30 years ago. Oops, I'm dating myself as far as club tenure here, but anyway.
Well, definitely a great idea. We'll definitely look into that and see if we can pull that in as our program sometime in the future. Anything else before we move on? So under new business, we have membership renewals, and Ann's going to speak to that. But before she does, I just wanted to throw out just a request. I know a lot of people in the past have renewed at the Christmas party, and that tends to be a little bit problematic. It slows things down. If you can renew online, that certainly is preferred, and we'll spread it out and make it so it's not a bottleneck. But Ann, go ahead and cover the new membership renewals.
Okay, thanks, Ray. This time of year, starting November 1st, actually, we start accepting anyone who's a new member who joins November 1st or later gets membership in this year and next year. Everybody who's a current member can start renewing for next year. And we do have a deadline, you know, within the first 2 months of the year, you need to be renewed, or we will take you off the distribution list for the mailing. So for the emails, I mean. So now is the time to start renewing, and the membership application is it's on the website under membership, or you can email me at secretary@wa7law.org, and I can send you the fillable. That's about it. But renew as soon as you can, and I guess.
Okay. Anything else before we move on to the next topic?
I just want to be clear about something. You said online, you can go online and get a copy of the fillable thing. You can't actually, we can't accept money online like you would, like a lot of people want. So just making that clarity.
Yeah, sorry about that. You're correct. The application is online. All right. So that covers all of the new business. Is there anybody who has new business that's not on the agenda? Now is your chance if you have any questions or comments. Victor, go ahead.
And sorry, I'm not excited about this news. It may be better under the good of the order, but I'll put it here. I think everybody should be aware. If there's any other member here that was at the county ACS meeting Thursday night, feel free to chime in and fill in some blanks if you can. There has been an issue with the repeater sites on DNR land, and apparently they charge like $2,400 per antenna or per transmitter, some such. And the way those funds are managed between the county, who pays a certain share, and I guess the legislature that pays a certain share, and they have not been getting their money. Their audit shows that they're bleeding, they're hemorrhaging really badly on what repeaters and other communication devices on those mountaintops are costing. So we have been ordered to remove, I shouldn't say we, but certain organizations have been ordered to remove their equipment from the towers on several of the DNR sites pending payment, but they have to be off by December 31st. Naturally, this looks like legislative action, which means that won't happen even until next year. The digital not DNR, what is DMR? Apparently, some of those repeaters have already been shut down. I think Gold Mountain has been affected. I do not know the rest of the sites in the alphabet, but if you hear people talking about changes or loss of sites, that is what's going on. They are closing down and removing repeaters. Thank you.
Looks like Rob has his hand up.
Rob, go ahead.
So the issue is out there, but it's quite a bit different. There has been a change in administration, as there will be. People retire, everything else at DNR, and there are some new fresh faces taking a look at things. And yes, it is true there are amateurs being asked to or being removed from DNR sites. One of the things that brought this to light was a request by some folks at Hamland to add additional antennas at one of the sites. That kicked off basically the new administration looking at things. They were already doing it as they would do when anyone comes in and takes over. DNR has a legislative requirement to basically be able to allow amateurs reduced rates to have repeater systems on their site. That lowers the effective cost to the amateur to about $100 a year. Now, normally that is in the $3,000 range for commercial sites. Everything's plus or minus. If you want to look up the RCW, you can find it. But one of the things that the request by Hamwan folks to add to a site uncovered was that we, as Hamwan, I won't say we because it's a separate group, I'm involved in that as well. Hamwan was installed at 3 or 4 different sites, actually probably half a dozen, under existing amateur leases. What they didn't know at the time was that none of those amateurs updated their transmitter paperwork, which is required, their lease paperwork, with DNR. And not only that, there are a lot of amateurs who really took advantage of that and installed additional UHF and VHF repeaters when they were only on record for having one, and things of that nature. So it uncovered, unfortunately, a pretty sizable mess that amateur radio as a collective hobby created with DNR. And DNR has a responsibility, it's like any public entity, for managing their assets and making sure that they collect revenue. Now, you have another wrinkle here in that the legislature passed a requirement or a RCW that basically said the state would reimburse DNR for the balance of that $100 versus $3,000 difference that revenue DNR would not be charging the amateur directly. So, but there's kind of an asterisk in that, and I don't know the exact detail of it, but the equivalent of it is that if funding is available, the legislature will reimburse DNR. Well, guess what? With the vagaries of government, there are plenty of opportunities where there are more important things for the budget, and DNR hasn't necessarily had their budget made whole. So that's another element that's come in. Well, DNR has basically gotten to the point where you have a bunch of, by law, illegal equipment on their sites. So they are doing their due diligence. There's a lot of amateurs that are basically crying, hey, we're getting kicked off, we serve MCOM, this, that, and the other thing. Yes, some of those points are very true. But if this was a commercial entity doing it, you would have a public uproar and a government uproar over fraud and all of that fun kind of stuff. While we don't like to use the word fraud with respect to amateurs because it doesn't speak well for us, there's aspects of that that could be viewed that direction. So yes, DNR is removing amateur equipment from a number of sites. Large Mountain down overlooking Portland has been one. That's already done. Gold Mountain, Rattlesnake, Capitol Peak, and there's one more that doesn't come to mind at the moment. Oh, Blinn up on the Straits are 4 more that I know of. Those are in process. The reality is there's people that are going to be discussing this and are already discussing this and making noise, but amateurs as a group basically need to abide by their contracts when they go into a place. And they also need to think of the impact to the rest of the amateur community as it is. Whether the noise and there's people involving state emergency management, the counties and things because of the MCOM aspect, and also because of general amateur radio. DNR needs to run their agency, their business, if you will, according to the law, and that's what they're trying to do. Now, whether this pushes the legislature to follow up more stringently and make their legislative commitment to the amateurs more fully funded instead of just whenever they feel like it, or if amateurs come off of the DNR properties permanently and they get to be replaced by commercial entities, either one of those clears that issue for DNR. So at this point, the process is working itself out. There's other people involved to deal with it. And I would strongly encourage that get the information for yourself, not just Victor or myself, whatever we've said to the issue. But if you're going to be discussing it with folks, get as much information as you can and make sure that you're fair to both sides of the argument. So with that, if anyone has any other questions for me personally on that, I do have more information I can share, but we can do that offline outside of the meeting if you like.
And if I could add
Well,
one more thing to that, please. Rob, thank you. I appreciate that much more. And I will stipulate to what you have said, yes. I think the one thing that's important for us as radio operators to remember is that when we're talking about this, we're not talking about a hobby. We're talking about public service. I can see the legislature saying we're not going to fund a hobby. They will fund public service and emergency communication, which is supposed to be the backbone of what we do. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for the for bringing it up, Victor, and for the additional information, Rob. Thank you, guys. Not seeing any. Oh, Carrie has something.
I want to thank everyone on the nominating committee, and I also wanted to thank the outgoing board members and for all of your support in running for president. And I want to let you know, I want you to be thinking about what you would like from the club, because I will be making phone calls and getting your input on things that you'd like to see. And also I have some ideas. I wanted to encourage those of you that are new. We have a couple of nets. We have 3 nets each week, and you're welcome to get on. And those are on the website, but we've got Sunday evening net. It's a great way to get on the air and just test your equipment and, also meet other hams. So we'd be happy to have you join that 7 p.m. on the 2-meter repeater. That information is on the website as well. We've also got Thursday evening, the YL net, and that's for everyone at 7 p.m. on the 2-meter. And then we've got our Dewey Digital net on Wednesday evenings, so on the 70 centimeters. So anyway, just some ideas. And once again, thanks to everybody. And I look forward to serving for you.
Well, thank you very much, Carrie, for running. Thank you for taking on the position. And thanks for reminding everybody of the nets. Definitely good opportunity for you to get on the air. A very friendly environment, very forgiving environment, particularly if you're new at it, and or even some of us that have been there for a while that don't get on the air as much. Good opportunity. So thanks, everyone. Looking forward to seeing and hearing everybody. Any other items before we move on? Seeing nothing, what we're going to do now is make a motion to adjourn the meeting, but hang on, don't leave. We have an incredible program being offered afterwards on propagation by Michael. And thank you very much, Michael, for doing this, and everybody enjoy. With that, is there a motion to end the business proportion of the meeting?
So moved.
And I move the adjourn.
Been moved
Sounds
and
like Rob
seconded.
second.
Any discussion? So the business portion of the meeting is done, and now we get into the fun part. Michael, go ahead with your propagation. I do need to drop off the call as I unfortunately have to go to work. But enjoy, and I'll look forward to hopefully being able to see Michael's presentation on video.
That four-letter word, huh?
Oh, yeah. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Ray.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
Well,
Thanks, Ray.
Well, I'm going to, I realized about 15 minutes before the meeting started that I'm going to attempt to mix two programs with whom I have had not the greatest relationships in the world. That would be PowerPoint and Zoom. So if there's a bright flash and a mushroom cloud over Lake Stevens, you'll know what happened. So let's see if we can cause this to happen. Let me share that. Are you seeing a slide that says fast track to understanding blah, blah, blah?
Yes.
Excellent. So far, so good. All right. So I am Michael Burnette, AF7KB, and I wrote the popular license training programs called the Fast Track series. You see them there. I also wrote this book. This is called Fast Track to Understanding Ham Radio Propagation. That book came about because of a request from a friend of mine and of yours. That would be John Van Dalen in 7AME. He has, I believe, well over 200 countries worked. It may be over 300 by this point because he's had some time on his hands. When he asked me to do a book on propagation, my first response was, well, gee, John, I kind of think maybe you should write me a book on propagation because I don't have 200 countries worked. For some reason, he declined that golden opportunity. So, well, here we are. So what is propagation? Well, my take on it is propagation is everything that happens to your signal between the transmitting antenna and the receiving antenna. Different things happen based on where the signal starts its journey, what's in the path of its journey, and what frequency that signal is. So maybe a more useful question, though, would be what is propagating? In other words, what is the nature of that radio signal? Understanding that is, to my mind, one of the keys to understanding propagation. Of course, the answer turns out to be anything but straightforward. Radio signals and light are dual-natured. In fact, they are so confoundingly strange that language sort of breaks down as we try to describe them. We could say that radio signals consist of particles and or they consist of waves. But even that tortured syntax doesn't quite convey the very strange duality of these things that we so casually fling out into the universe. Now, fair warning, this does get a little weird. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to use a digital camera, in fact, the sensor of a digital camera, and we're going to expose it to some particular scene. We'll track what happens to the charges on all the millions of cells in that sensor. We'll see how many cells get affected by the light and to what extent they're affected. And let's say the result ends up looking something like this. Then we'll place what's called a neutral density filter in front of the sensor, and we'll check our results. A neutral density filter is just a gray piece of glass. Now, for this experiment, we have a perfect sensor, by the way, with no threshold levels to complicate our calculations. So if light is a wave, we should see the same number of cells affected, but affected to a lesser extent, something like this, because the wave's magnitude would be reduced by the filter. But that's not what we see at all. What we see is that fewer cells are affected. They're affected just the same amount, but fewer of them are affected. Clearly, the filter is blocking some of the particles of light, and we have proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that light is made up of particles and clearly not made up of waves. We should probably book our trip to Sweden to accept our Nobel Prize and the Ham of the Year award. But wait, Let's double check those results. We know from our VHF UHF experience about multipath distortion or multipath interference. Multipath happens when a signal gets bounced around and it takes several paths of different lengths to our receiver. Some of the signals arrive out of phase, the peaks and valleys interfere with each other, and we end up with lousy reception. Wait a minute. What? Peaks, valleys, phase relationships? What is this nonsense? Particles don't have those. They're just discrete packets of energy. What do they care if another particle does or does not arrive at a particular time? Besides, how can you add something, one particle, to something else, another particle, and get nothing? Proof positive, then, radio is waves. By the way, the same sort of demonstration can be done with light, but we're radio people, so we're playing with radio waves. I warned you this would get weird. It's so weird that to have something resembling a coherent conversation about it, we're forced to fall back on metaphors and analogies and not quite accurate statements to wrap our minds around it. Now, don't worry. Physicists do the same thing. So just in case there are any physics professors with us today, I didn't see David Carlson here, but you got to watch out for him. Let me say right up front, I have taken some severe liberties with the physics involved here in order to serve the multiple interests of time, intelligibility, and minimum math. Now, in the book, we cover about a dozen distinct modes of propagation and several subsets of those modes. We're not going to cover all those today because I know time is valuable. Instead, we'll look at a handful of modes, and along the way, we'll note whether we can apply the particle model or the wave model to better understand those modes, because we can use either one. We're going to start down here on the ground, and we'll work our way up to the sky. Now, we're not going to try to resolve the dualistic nature of electromagnetic radiation here today. There's no treasure down that hole. Instead, since we can interpret a radio signal as either a wave or a particle phenomenon at our convenience, we'll use that fact to further our understanding of propagation. The good news, though, is that you are free to think of any given mode of propagation as either a wave or a particle phenomenon, whichever makes the most sense to you. So let's start with ground wave propagation. This one's a favorite of the top banders, the folks on the 160-meter band. A ground wave leaves the transmitting antenna, and at least for a while it goes cross-country, following the curvature of the Earth. How does this happen? Don't radio waves always travel in a straight line? Well, here's a spoiler alert. The answer here in the real world is no, they don't, almost never. We learn early on in our radio education that radio waves travel at the speed of light, right? Which is true as far as it goes. It's just that the speed of light isn't always, well, the speed of light, or at least it isn't always 300 million meters per second. That's the speed of light in a vacuum. In air, the speed of light is a little slower, and also radio waves are a little slower. And through the Earth, that speed is considerably slower. To create a ground wave, we need an antenna, obviously, and vertical is generally the superior choice here. And we need ground radials. So, think of that system as inducing a wave that's partially in the air and partially in the Earth. The part of the wave passing through the Earth is moving just a bit slower than the part passing through the air, and so that whole contraption, as it moves along, sort of leans over, and it sticks close to the ground. It's something like when you're riding an escalator and your hand is traveling just a little faster than your feet. Which, by the way, we can send a man to the moon. Why can't we get an escalator's handrail and the, I don't know. I mentioned that top banders, those folks on 160 meters, are very interested in ground waves. They can provide excellent propagation in the near range, say out to about 50 miles or so. Ground wave propagation is superbly dependable. It's they don't fade, they don't disappear if you get a building between you and the transmitter, and they don't stop working because the sunspots are having a bad day or a bad decade, as the case may be. So how do we create these ground waves? Well, commercial AM stations operating down there just below our 160 meter band spend lots of money to create strong ground waves. Why? Because local is where the money is. To do that, they have massive ground radial systems under their vertical antennas. Typically, they have about 120 quarter wave ground radials strung out around the base of their quarter wave vertical antenna. That is a lot of copper, a lot of expensive copper. A more economical solution for us is the inverted L antenna with a horizontal element, a vertical element, and ground radials that are more along the lines of what most of us are accustomed to in ham radio. In other words, not 120 quarter meter radials strung out around the antenna, but a more modest number of, usually because we're working in our backyards, varying length. Now, ground waves depend on ground conductivity. The more of it, the better. So if you want to create a great ground wave, have the foresight to live in a part of the country with great ground conductivity. Here's the official FCC map of US ground conductivity. And if you can read those tiny little numbers, which indicate millimos per meter of conductivity, so higher numbers are better, you'll see that Oklahoma and Kansas and a lot of that center section of the US has pretty fantastic ground conductivity. And most of the West Coast, not so much. You would think up here in Western Washington, as soggy as we are, that we'd have fantastic ground conductivity. However, if you take a look, we have about 2 millimos per meter. Ground conductivity is not a function of how wet the ground is, it's how much minerals are in the ground, and all that water washed all the minerals out of our ground a long time ago. You'll also want to choose the right frequency to create a ground wave. It is really unlikely that you'll create much of a ground wave at frequencies above about 5 megahertz. And even if you do create one, it won't go very far. So 160 meters, yes. 80 meters, maybe. 60 meters, not totally impossible. 40 meters, probably not. All right, now let's touch on VHF, UHF propagation. We all learn about line of sight propagation when we study for our technician license, but the test never mentions the fact that down here on the ground in the real world, pure line of sight is pretty rare. I'd be so bold as to say that most of the time, there's no such thing as line of sight propagation. For most of us, the predominant form of propagation that we're using in the VHF and UHF bands is not line of sight, but terrestrial scatter. Our signal is being affected by goodness knows how many buildings, cars, trucks, mountains, people, deer, elk, who knows what else on the way to the receiver. Now, Carrie and I live on the backside of a hill relative to our club's repeater. And on paper, based on that line of sight thing, there's no way our signal can hit that repeater. Here's a model of the topography between us and the repeater. That's us on the right, and that's a big old hill in the way. And yet, there we are on the club net just about every week. How are we doing that? Our best guess is we're either knife edge diffracting our way over that mountain, which is not likely given the topography, or we're bouncing off the side of a mountain probably around 10 miles north of our house that has a clear shot at the repeater and at our house. Now, in this sort of propagation, we can think of our signal as a stream of particles. So here's our particle model. Ping pong balls, ping-ponging semi-randomly around the area. Another way that VHF, UHF signals get to places beyond the line of sight is tropospheric or tropospheric scatter, depending on where you went to meteorology school. Our atmosphere is usually not perfectly homogeneous. Think of a cup of coffee into which you've just poured some cream before you stir it. That cup of coffee would represent the atmosphere, and there are discontinuities in that cup of coffee. And there are also discontinuities in our atmosphere. Each of those discontinuities presents an opportunity for refraction. That is, after all, where refraction happens at abrupt changes in density. Think of refraction as a bending of the signal's path. Bend that signal enough times, and even if it's just a little bit each time, it might get pointed back toward Earth and make it far over the horizon. Tropospheric scatter, or just troposcatter to its fans, doesn't often work in our favor, though. Usually, it's just a source of multipath. Like a terrestrial version of sporadic E, though, every now and then it opens up, and much to the delight of the VHF, UHF, and microwave DXers, yay, we have propagation over the horizon. Now, I think those forms of scatter are best understood with the particle model, ping pong ball model. Let's take a look at something that's probably best understood with the wave model. This isn't really a propagation mode, but it is something that can at times rather drastically affect even a very ordinary, works on paper, line of sight transmission, and it is called the Fresnel zone. It's named for this happy French fellow, Augustin Jean Fresnel, who obviously knew nothing about radio, but did study light. So here's a nice, clean, open path between two nice high mountain tops. This is a happy signal path, totally free of obstructions, right? Now, how often does that happen in the real world? Well, the answer, of course, is not often enough. It seems like there are almost always obstructions of some sort, yet somehow radio communications work day in and day out. So the question is, how bad is bad when it comes to signal paths? Well, there's actually a reasonably simple formula to model the zone between the transmitter and the receiver that needs to be fairly free of obstructions to produce a useful signal at the receiver. So that zone is called the Fresnel zone. And that pattern that you see there is not the radiation pattern of the transmitting antenna. It's just roughly the shape of the Fresnel zone. If something reflective impinges on the Fresnel zone, signal quality degrades. Now, in reality, I'm telling you half of the story, but hang in there. We'll get to chapter 2. In this picture, that mountain in the middle is going to seriously impede the transmission, even though it is shorter than the other two, and there's a perfectly clear line of sight between the two antennas. If you take your binoculars and look from mountain A to mountain B, you'll see a perfectly clear line of sight. But simply put, that mountain in the middle is going to create an interference pattern, and that will cancel part or even all of our signal. We can calculate the radius of the Fresnel zone at any point along the signal path with a reasonably simple formula. It is radius equals 1/2 of the square root of lambda times d. Lambda is the wavelength of the frequency we want to use, and d is the distance from either the transmitter or the receiver, whichever is closer. The rule of thumb is that 60% of the Fresnel zone has to be clear of the radius of the Fresnel zone, has to be clear at any given point. So for a practical number, the full formula would be radius equals 1/2 the square root of lambda times d times 0.6. Now, here's how this might apply in the real world. First, I do realize that most of the folks here are unlikely to be calculating the Fresnel zone that extends between your car's dual band antenna and the local repeater. That path is either going to work or it isn't, and it's going to change by the time you drive 10 feet anyway. But let's say we want to build a permanent auxiliary transmitter that will send signals to a repeater up on top of a local mountain. We do a path study on one of several computer-based tools that can do that sort of thing, and we end up with something like this. So this is the topography between our transmitter and our receiver, and everything here looks absolutely great right up until we get to this point about 12 kilometers from the receiver, marked point A. Right there, we have 20 meters of clearance over the top of that peak. Well, what frequency do we need to use to put a solid signal up to the receiver? Now, let's add a complicating social factor. Our club member, Bob, it's always Bob, who has been a ham since about the time they invented lightning, has somewhere in his garage, it's pretty sure anyway, a perfectly fine, if slightly dusty, Heathkit 2-meter radio, solid state. And while he is reluctant to part with this potentially priceless antique, his wife would be very pleased indeed if he were to loan it to the club forever for this auxiliary station. Should we take him up on this almost irresistible offer? Let's check the numbers. Uh-oh. We have 20 meters of radius, but the formula says we need a radius of 47 meters. That won't work unless we build a taller tower on one end or the other. A quick illustration, by the way, of why in antennas, height is always might. Well, sorry about that, Mrs. Bob, but we're going to need to make that a 70-centimeter repeater. Now, I've had personal and rather stressful experience with the Fresnel zone. I was working at a commercial FM station in beautiful San Diego, California, and we were moving the studios from one downtown building that would be, let's see, it's right about here, to another that's right about here. We were also, the lease was expiring on the original building, so we were kind of in a hurry. It turned out that the top of another building was just poking its big hairy toe, it's that brown building right there, into our signal path and into our Fresnel zone. Well, another section of path, some hasty construction, strictly to code and with all the necessary permits, I assure you, and we were back in business. Now, I told you I'd get to the other half of the story, and this is it. The interference patterns created by impingements in the Fresnel zone aren't necessarily destructive. They can also be constructive, leading to an even stronger signal. Given all the measurements, we always suspected that we didn't manage to raise that antenna enough to clear the corner of that building, but had just changed position enough to make the interference pattern constructive rather than destructive. In any case, it worked, and the boss didn't throw us off the top of the building, so everybody was happy. And that gets us to what I guess is the big topic when it comes to propagation, and that, of course, is the ionosphere. To be an active HF operator is to have let's say, a relationship with the ionosphere. And for at least some people, that can be a pretty emotional relationship. So the ionosphere stretches from, hello, change slides, or I will hurt you. There we go. The ionosphere is the second highest part of Earth's atmosphere, and the top layer is the exosphere. It's in the exosphere. Now, the exosphere is really just the transition to outer space, and there's not a lot of interest for us way up there at the top. And there's also not much of interest for us way down at the bottom. So from about 30 miles up to about 1,000 miles up is this area called the ionosphere. The air is very thin up there. The molecules are a long way away from each other. And that's to the tune of about anywhere from 100,000 times thinner than our air to over 1,000,000 times thinner. There are four large complex forces at work in this area. They are solar radiation, Earth's geomagnetic core and geomagnetic field, terrestrial weather, and ionospheric weather. So in solar radiation, the sun is constantly bombarding us and the rest of the solar system with radiation. In the case of the ionosphere, the relevant radiation for us is in the ultraviolet and X-ray frequencies. The solar wind also has its effects on the ionosphere, as well as the occasional blasts of high energy particles from solar storms. But day in and day out, it's that UV and X-ray radiation. The geomagnetic field, well, this is the way it's usually taught to us. It's very nice and tidy and symmetrical and lovely. That's not how it is. The Earth's geomagnetic field is a constantly shifting and wobbling thing. The result, probably, don't know for sure, of what is basically a giant sloppy electrical generator at the center of the Earth. So here's a supercomputer generated idea of what's more like the real geomagnetic field, and you can see in some places it almost ties itself in knots. The solid iron core in the center of the Earth sloshes around. It's surrounded by magma, and as it sloshes around, it generates electrical currents. We know where there are electrical currents, there are a magnetic field, and there's where our geomagnetic field probably comes from. Terrestrial weather can affect the ionosphere, both with massive air movements and temperature changes beneath the ionosphere, and we think by pumping ions into the ionosphere from the tops of thunderstorms. I'm going to underline we think, but there is some evidence to suggest that ion pumping from the top of big thunderstorms might have something to do with sporadic E. Then there's ionospheric weather. Well, that consists mostly of really, really ferociously fast winds and the turbulence that goes along with them. Well, four semi-random forces interacting in a semi-random way do not add up to a system whose behavior is easily predicted, nor one that's easily understood. Fortunately, the dominant force of all of these is the sun. And we have a reasonably good handle on its effects. So we can generate at least some modestly useful, notice all the disclaimers I have in here, predictions, mostly with some vintage software known as VOACAP. I would just caution you that even if the so-called official prediction is for lousy propagation, that doesn't necessarily make it so. Really, propagation predictions have been almost universally for poor propagation for what, about a decade now. Yet consider this. The ARRL continues to send out those DXCC awards constantly. So somebody out there is getting some propagation. Well, so what's going on up there in the ionosphere? Well, as that ultraviolet and X-ray radiation comes bombing in from the sun, it knocks electrons in the air molecules out of their orbits and out essentially into free space. What was a space of neutral charge has now become a space of not neutral charge. The free electron's carrying a negative charge. The atom that it left behind is carrying a positive charge. And now for our purposes today, we don't really care about the atom. We're interested in the electron. We like refraction of radio signals, and that's created by those free electrons floating around in space. And do remember, those electrons want to rejoin an atom somewhere, and that becomes really critical later in our story. The nighttime ionosphere is different from the daytime ionosphere. Of course, in reality, the ionosphere is staying more or less the same. We're just rotating under it, but we talk about the nighttime and daytime ionosphere. the part of the ionosphere in the Earth's shadow is getting a lot less solar radiation than the part facing the sun. In fact, that whole lower part of the ionosphere, the D layer and some of the E layer, doesn't have much going on in the way of free electrons at all on the night side, which turns out to be good news for us. That lowest layer is the layer we call the D layer. You might wonder, what happened to the A, B, and C layers? Well, when Edward Appleton first started researching the ionosphere, he discovered that there was a region at a fairly constant level above ground that would return electromagnetic waves, get it? So he called it the E layer for short, because who wants to write out electromagnetic over and over in your notebook? Later, we discovered more layers and named them the D layer and the F layer, and we found out the F layer separates into F1 and F2 during the day. During the night, they blend together into one layer. Those layers' boundaries are really fuzzy and constantly shifting, and they're defined by the rate of change in the free electron density versus altitude, and by their behavior in regard to radio waves. So the D layer, you'll notice, disappears at night, leaving us, at least for a little while around sunset and sunrise, with the E layer. That's when we get that nice gray line propagation, often running north and south along the line of the sunset or the sunrise. So why is it that sometimes 20 meters works at night and sometimes it doesn't? Well, that has to do with levels of solar activity. And the easiest indicator we have for increased solar activity is the presence of sunspots. And you see some right there. Those aren't bad spots on the film. Those are sunspots. HF operators love to see those. Simply put, more sunspots equals more solar activity equals better propagation. So understand, sunspots don't create propagation. They're just a symptom of what does create propagation, which is heightened solar radiation. In other words, the sun's burning just a little bit brighter. For reasons we really do not understand, solar activity, and thus sunspots and good HF propagation, follow a 22-year cycle. The poles, the north and south poles of the sun, flip. Every 11 years, the north becomes the south, and another 11 years, the south becomes the north. That means we have an 11-year peak cycle for HF propagation and, of course, sunspots, or not. Sometimes the solar maximum is a dud. Like this last one here, it really never got much beyond that, and it didn't last very long anyway. Sometimes the solar maximum doesn't show up at all, like during the Maunder minimum back around 1645 to 1715. Nobody in 1675 got their DX Century Club award because HF propagation was terrible then. Some of us remember. Regarding all this, nobody knows the mechanisms behind it. There are many mysteries about our ionosphere and our sun that we have not yet solved. And I know the wise and learned people get on the YouTube and they pontificate about it's going to be a great solar cycle, or it's going to be a terrible solar cycle, or it's going to be an ordinary solar cycle. And I'm telling you, they don't know for sure because we don't understand what's going on. To understand what's happening to our radio signals in ionospheric propagation, I think it's useful to use our particle model of radio signals. So to get a radio signal refracted, we need what you might call the Goldilocks combination of atmospheric density and solar radiation. So imagine a photon from our antenna blasting up to the ionosphere. One of three things is going to happen next. One, your signal zaps straight through the ionosphere, never to be heard from again by anyone on Earth. Two, your signal gets refracted back to Earth. Or three, your signal gets absorbed by the ionosphere, which in practical terms is about the same thing as zapping straight through, but in physics terms is completely different. All right, so imagine you're transmitting on 20 meters. For our little fantasy here this morning, that photon that you're sending out is 20 meters wide. It gets up to the ionosphere and it encounters a bunch of free electrons that are about, say, 19 meters apart from each other. Again, this is fiction. Bam, that signal gets bent, at least a little bit, from its straight path to outer space. It encounters a few more free electrons, spaced 19 meters apart, and then a few more. And the next thing you know, well, it's headed back to Earth, away from the charged particles. And some ham thousands of miles away is anxiously listening for your signal. And there it is. That is a simple version of ionospheric propagation, the phenomenon that makes worldwide HF radio communications possible. Your signal has become what we call a sky wave as opposed to a ground wave. Now, in practice, that sky wave might come back to Earth, bounce off the Earth, head back up to the ionosphere, get bounced again, and maybe even repeat that cycle up to 5 times before reaching that distant antenna. So imagine you're holding a beach ball that's 2 feet in diameter. That beach ball is your signal. You're trying to bounce it off a picket fence, perhaps while blindfolded. If the fence's pickets are an inch apart, that ball's going to bounce back just about every time, right? Now, imagine that you're holding a beach ball that's 2 feet around, but the fence pickets are 3 feet apart. Well, it's not going to bounce back nearly as often. You would need, in this case, a 4-foot beach ball, or a lower frequency radio wave in this analogy, to make that work dependably. So the maximum usable density is determined by the free electron density. In other words, how far apart the pickets on the fence are. As we get more free electrons, the MUF, the maximum usable frequency, or the shortest usable wavelength, goes higher. More free electron density equals higher frequencies bounce. So if that's the case, 160 meters, our lowest common ham radio frequency, the one with the colossal wavelength, the biggest beach ball, must be the absolute best for skipping signals around the globe, right? I'm watching John Van Dalen as I ask this question, and he's saying, no, that's not right. Well, before I answer the why of it, there's something that might, at first glance, seem like a distinction without a difference, but it's about to become very significant. When we bounce a signal off our ionosphere, it is not getting reflected, not really. What it's getting is absorbed and re-radiated. So that electron up there is sitting there, our 20-meter signal hits it, and the electron says, hey, ooh, extra energy. And then it releases that energy, and our signal goes its merry way. It's like we've moved our transmitting antenna to a spot a couple of 100 miles high. So why wouldn't 160 meters be the best possible DX frequency? Why do we even need the other bands after all? Well, there isn't just an MUF, a maximum usable frequency. There's also an LUF, the lowest usable frequency. So get below that LUF and the signal just gets absorbed by the lower layers of the ionosphere and it never gets re-radiated. How does that happen? Okay, there's another mechanism at work here. In order to re-radiate your signal, an electron must remain a free electron without rejoining another atom for at least the duration of one cycle of your signal. If it finds an ion that's missing an electron and recombines before it can re-radiate the signal, it just absorbed, it will join that atom and give up the energy of your signal as heat. Even if it just slams into a neutral atom, it will give up some energy as heat. Well, if that happens, you're not communicating, you're just warming up the ionosphere with your expensive watts. Your beach ball is a goner, in other words. Now, in the upper layers of the ionosphere, free electrons can last for hours, even days. If they're close together, such as in the D layer, free electrons might only last a microsecond or less. At a microsecond, any frequency under 1 megahertz is too low and it'll get absorbed. Since the 160 meter band starts at 1.8 megahertz, well, any recombination faster than about 2 microseconds is going to eat 100% of our signal. Even at a full 2 microseconds, chances are good that our signal got there too late for about half of the free electrons because they've already been out for, a microsecond or so. Now, of course, anything could happen with any individual free electron, but we can calculate the average rate of ionization and recombination for a given layer under given conditions, and that's called the plasma frequency, and that plasma frequency is what drives the MUF calculations. Longer waves tend to get absorbed more than shorter waves. In fact, the ratio of absorption of two different frequencies can be expressed mathematically as the inverse square of the wavelength. Simply put, double the wavelength, you get 4 times as much absorption. So let's see how this all stacks up layer by layer. Here's the D layer. In the D layer, we have lots and lots of molecules because the air is pretty thick. But not much radiation to ionize them because a lot of it got sucked up by the upper layers of the atmosphere. Because the molecules are in close proximity, the few electrons that get free are rapidly reabsorbed. Lots of free molecules there. Since the MUF is determined by the amount of space between the free electrons, and the D layer's free electrons have a lot of space between them, the MUF will be relatively low, making the D layer useless for VHF-UHF. Higher frequencies just shoot straight through to space. And as you're going to see, in the case of the D layer, MUF might as well stand for maximum unusable frequency. At the same time, because of the proximity of those molecules, the recombination rate in the D layer is very rapid. That means only higher frequencies could possibly be re-radiated. Lower frequencies will be absorbed before they can be re-radiated. In normal conditions, on the average day, that means when it comes to propagation, there is no frequency that is high enough to get through the D layer and be refracted back to Earth by the layers above. And there's no frequency low enough to not get absorbed by the D layer. It's kind of like, think of a number lower than 4 and higher than 5. For us, almost always, the D layer is a dud. Shortly after sunset, thank goodness, the D layer starts to disappear. Now, because it is up higher and stays in the sunlight longer, the E layer persists. In the E layer, the molecules have thinned out. The radiation level is higher than in the D layer. We have more free electrons, but we also still have relatively rapid recombination happening, though it's slower than in the D layer. During the day, most of the time, we can't get anything through the D layer that can be refracted by the E layer, and that adds up to 0 or very limited daytime propagation from the E layer. However, when isolated pockets of very high free electron density occur in the E layer, we have possibilities for low VHF, that's 10 meter or 6 meter usually, propagation. Those frequencies can get through the D layer and under these conditions can get refracted by the E layer. That's what we call sporadic E propagation. Lower frequencies won't work in sporadic E because the recombination rate is still too high in the E layer. But in a sporadic E pocket, there are enough free electrons to refract a higher frequency signal. Then there's the F layer. This is really the DX layer. It's the highest region of them all. There's barely any atmosphere up there at all. And now the atmospheric density has thinned out so much, and the radiation is at its maximum. Lots and lots of free electrons get created, and they last a long, long time. That's why the F layer is, with even a little help from solar conditions, rich, rich territory for HF propagation. There are plenty of free electrons to refract a wide range of frequencies, and the absorption rate is very, very low. Well, the very, very good news about ionospheric propagation is that it looks like, underline that, we're getting a pretty good start on the next solar maximum. In other words, there's a chance that HF propagation is going to get better and better over the next few years. So what are the techniques to take advantage of this happy circumstance? Well, the most important technique is highly technical. I want some of you to write this down. That technique is stay alive long enough for propagation to improve. Sometimes patience is a virtue, and in this case, it really is. Next most important, and if you've been a ham for more than 15 minutes, you can guess what I'm about to say. It is have the right antenna. Having a jazzy new HF radio is all well and good, and they're a lot of fun, and they do some remarkable things. But at the risk of being pilloried by the radio merchants out there, people have been communicating all over the world for a very long time with far less sophisticated radios than what's available from the merchants these days. Having a high power amplifier is very nice too, but unless it's hooked up to the right antenna, not much wonderful is going to happen. The object of the game for DX is to get our signal to encounter lots of long-lasting free electrons up in the F layer. So takeoff angle is very important, and generally the lower the better. So here are three different takeoff angles. You can see signal A is taking off, encountering the minimum amount of ionosphere, and it's headed for a galaxy far, far away. Signal B encounters more atmosphere because it had a lower takeoff angle, and it gets bent, but not quite enough, and it's still headed for another galaxy, still far, far away. Signal C takes off almost straight across the horizon, and it gets bent back to Earth, and at last, we're having a QSO with an Earthling. Now, what antenna will produce this wonderful effect? Well, one of my favorite things I ever heard about antennas is when it comes to antennas, the short answer is there is no short answer. However, I'm going to try and make this brief. The main lobes of a properly installed, that's italicized, half-wave horizontal dipole will have a takeoff angle of about 35 degrees. The -3 dB beam width of the lobes will stretch from about 15 degrees up to 50 degrees. I don't care about the 50 degrees, but that 15 degrees is honestly not bad at all. That will get the job done in even semi-decent conditions. Even if you buy one of the commercial kits, folks, the cost for a typical multiband horizontal dipole is in the dozens of dollars. Now, for those of us without any possibility of getting a dipole the proper distance in the air to achieve that, which would be an honest 1/2 wavelength up, please know that suboptimum can still work. It just won't be, well, optimum. But optimum is not required. I strongly suspect that if I went out and inspected 100 random ham antenna installations, about 99 or so would be in some significant way suboptimum, and yet they work. So if you want to play on the HF bands, charge ahead, please. Your success will depend a lot more on your persistence and the sunspot index rather than whether or not you have the perfect setup. Now, of course, if you have the budget and the land and the commitment, sure, there's the big tower with the big beam antenna at the top. But I really want you to be clear. Those are in the nice to have list. They're not in the need to have list. I'll go back one last time to our friend who inspired the book, Mr. More Than 200 Countries Worked. He does have a beam antenna. I don't know if this is a secret, John, but he does. But to my eye, it does not look like it's quite like those in the picture. It's not on a tower like that. It's on a much lower tower. For 40 and 80 meters, he has a long wire strung from the top of the tower to the top of his two-story house. It is certainly not the prescribed 130 feet above the ground, and yet 200 countries worked. It's hard to argue with those results. Well, we've gone a good long time and barely even skimmed the surface of this topic of propagation, but I hope you at least have a framework to use to think about propagation. And if you walk away with nothing else, walk away with the notion that there are literally many, many possible paths to successful communication, no matter what band you are on. So I'd be happy to take questions if anybody has any, if anybody's left.
Thank you, Michael. Outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. And I'll get it up on YouTube either this afternoon or tomorrow early. So if that's all right with you.
It's fine with me. Send me a copy. I'll put it up on my channel too.
We'll send out a link to it.
There you go.
Oh, copy of it. Yes. Okay. Yep.
Hey, Michael, that was awesome. I thought I understood it fairly well. Well, I mean, a micro parsec of it. That was great. And
I thought so. I thought I did too. So there you go.
And to your point, though, just one thing is you were talking about the F layer and how far the ions are apart and how long they can last.
Yeah.
When we're watching our current solar cycle over here, we get our peaks and then our valleys, because the sun is still kind of going back and forth. For enhanced propagation, from what I've read, that the longer we have that and the more free electrons we set flying in space over there that are of long duration requires an elevated solar activity for a longer period of time to ensure that that propagation. So when you see the peaks and valleys, you see it really, really high one day and you're saying, oh, the conditions are still crappy. It's because the F layer is still developing those free electrons over there, and over time you're going to get more and more, and they last a long time. And there's just more of them. So when our solar activity is high for a long period of time, that's going to enhance our propagation.
Yeah, it's a lot like charging a battery. It takes a little time to build up those electrons in there.
Yes, and your analogies make it a lot more clear. Thank you. That is absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. A good presentation. And yes, I do have, if you look at my QRZ page, I got 223, but that's over 40 years. And then there's 243 that the rest of them are not confirmed, the 10 for one reason or another. But it's one of those things that you have to look at the time, the day, mostly the time of day. And with this cycle coming up 25, as somebody already remarked on the chat, 15 meters has been open, 10 meters is open, and mostly on FT8, but it's still open, and those things count for DXCC. And what was it, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I actually worked Cayman Islands on 6 meters. Now that's what, 44,000 miles on a band that is typically good to 100 miles at the most. But so it's watching. You showed that chart about the upper and the lower usable bands. Those are really important to look at. And that gives you a good idea, but the best thing is to get on the radio and listen. Listen for other people talking. And right now there's a lot of 20 meters are open. And what's funny, it's 20 meters to the East Coast is working quite nicely, but the Midwest is not. How do you answer that? You can't. You just have to accept it. Or stay on the radio long enough to listen for somebody. But and then of course on 20 meters you can't hear somebody in Vancouver. So it's really tough. And yeah, the beam has helped. I've had that for 35 years, and it's a big part of my ham radio. So thank you. I appreciate the remarks on the propagation. It's important for this hobby.
How tall is that tower, John?
It's 30, let's see, the upper antenna is about 35, 36 feet.
Yeah.
And I didn't do any calculations for spacing antennas. I have 3 antennas within 10 feet of each other. And the wire antennas, like you said, one is going between 2 houses and the other one's kind of got a 90-degree bend in it. And it's not optimum. I don't have the room. So I had to create something. And they work.
Michael, Victor Harris.
Hi, Victor.
Henry put something out there that got me thinking for a second, because he was talking about the summer activity. And it raises a question, are these issues with solar flares and propagation and all the rest, are these hemispheric or are these global? Because Australia is in wintertime when we're in summertime. So are they a reverse effect from us?
Yeah, in some things. So sporadic E has its season in the north, and it also has its season in the south, for instance. And yeah, winter time in the southern hemisphere for the ionosphere is different from summertime. I mean, yeah, it is hemispheric. So obviously their winter is our summer and vice versa. And they have a winter ionosphere during the winter. What you need to think about is not really what's their ionosphere, not even what's our ionosphere, what's the ionosphere between us and them. That's what's going to make the propagation. That took me forever to work out and get from some definitive source, but it's not what's right over your head, and it's not what's right over their head. It's what's in between that makes the propagation.
Well, the other question that came up was with John talking about East Coast and West Coast, and the Midwest being not so prolific. That strikes me what you were talking about at the beginning about ground wave, and that the coastal ranges were 2s and 3s and 4s, and the Midwest was 18 and 19. I think something got reversed there. Their 18s are wiping them out, and they don't have the ground wave to communicate with us. The other half of it would be takeoff angle, wouldn't it? The takeoff angle of the antenna to get the bounce back, either to come back down in Kansas or come back down in New York or Florida.
It also has to do with the ionospheric conditions. Let me toss this screen up, Victor. There we go. Should be seeing a ray tracing diagram. And so notice there's a skip zone down here. And that varies depending on the conditions up here, right? It depends on where the signal is getting refracted, what its takeoff angle was, and all that. But the reason we call it working skip isn't because it's skipping across the earth. It's because they found out real early there's this skip zone, and then somehow the signal showed up over here, and that's how we figured out there was an ionosphere and stuff. So right now, generally what's happening is there's, some say this is the East Coast. Well, here's the Midwest right in here, and that'll be in the skip zone. Now, as conditions change, that will open up again, and this will be, maybe this will be just Washington State or something. And then the signals will get refracted back down closer to home, maybe not as far as away.
Michael, one of the things that you'll notice, or you will notice as you're on the radio, that Dave, in a lot of cases, Dave Williamson would have a lot better chance picking off DX than we would, because the propagation between Europe, say Europe, and the US is better in Arizona versus Western Washington. Now, that could be because of the mountains, the Cascades, and of course the ionic sphere, the upper and lower MFU, whatever those are.
MUF.
And, I know what I can see them in my head, but
Right.
And you can hear Arizona just knocking people off right and left, but you can barely hear them, or they can't hear you. And so it's really hard to say that Arizona, if you listen to Arizona stations, you're going to get the same atmosphere. You're not. It's quite a bit different. And even with the signal, they may hear you very well, but you can hardly hear them, or the reverse. There's that also. So it's quite a phenomenon. It's just getting on at the right time and finding the right person that you want to talk to at the time. And that's where contesting comes in, because it kind of teaches you those time segments from the start of a contest to the end of the contest, which ones are better to work than not. So that's why I've been publishing some of the contest information. They're really important. But thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Michael? And
Yes, sir.
that was a great presentation, but for my non-technical mindset, can you repeat all of that using 3-syllable words or less?
Somebody send Tim the book.
Speaking of the book, where is your book available?
It's available from Carrie Burnett. You give her your name and it will magically appear for you. Because we always provide all our publications free for club members.
Oh, wow. Great. Okay. Thank you. That was a great presentation.
Except Dave Summers, who beat me up one day at a breakfast because he can't accept gratuities or something.
Oh, okay.
They're well worth the money.
Hey, Carrie, I popped my name and call sign in the chat window. I don't know if you saw it. I'd like to get one of the copies of the book, please.
Done.
All right.
She's on
Yeah, I have, let's see here. So I've got Alan Person for one of the books, Dave Williamson, Steve Ramsayer, and Ken McCarthy so far. Anybody else? Speak up and I'll get you a book.
Thank you.
I see Eldon wants one, his mouth's open.
Eldon, did you want one?
Hey, Carrie,
Okay, go ahead, Dave.
he's muted. I was going to say, Carrie, I was interested when you were pointing out there on the minerals in the ground and looking, as I focused on Arizona, I was thinking of we've got a lot of copper mines here. So we have a higher mineral content, which I thought was surprising. Not sure what they could mine in the Midwest, because man, some of those numbers were 36, 30 on that chart. I was kind of amazed with that. But anyway, interesting to know. Very well given presentation.
Dave, I can tell you haven't spent a lot of time in the Midwest. I have one word for you: salt.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, salt.
Colossal salt mines under the Midwest.
Yeah. Okay.
I've
cool.
driven a semi truck through salt mines there that they've converted into warehouses. It's mind boggling, the size of these
Yes,
things.
I've seen a lot of different videos on the salt mines and stuff, and in Europe and some other places where they've converted stuff into other things, like you just said. You know, you can warehouse anything down there. Amazing stuff. Thank you.
Sure.
And actually, we have, of course, we have a lot of volcanic activity. We have sulfide deposits as well, which is where you'll get a lot of mining, some gold and other things. And also we have very low conductivity.
Yeah, we just don't, there's just not enough gold out there for good conductivity.
You know, I was just thinking I got to go outside and check my backyard. I might have a gold deposit, and maybe, I don't know.
My dad, who's a retired broadcast engineer, started out his broadcasting career in Eastern Washington, said the same type of thing about the ground having extra minerals or things in to make it more conductive for ground planes for AM radio stations. And on the salt mine thing, just a little piece of trivia, the old Tonight shows with Johnny Carson on the 1-inch videotapes, they are actually in a salt mine in the Midwest someplace, because you got to keep the videotape cool so it doesn't deteriorate. So also a lot cheaper to store it there too, I think.
You can get the same effect too if you, you know, buy salt water. I've been at Fort Casey with a portable antenna and 100 watts and worked 5 continents in one day.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a commercial AM station in Santa Cruz, California, that has its antennas sitting out in the salt marsh. I always wanted to buy it just for the antenna system.
Well, I know when I worked at ICOM, when people would take their sailboats and they would cut the backstay for the HF radios, and they'd take a dynaplate that's touching the salt water, gave them excellent ground pains on HF on this and seawater. So just due to the salt and the conductivity of the water.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, Scott and his partner over there, DEM, they used to go out on their boat and they'd do the same thing. They'd do their stuff from out on the boat with the salt water. It was good stuff.
Well, what is good about this cycle is in the last 45 minutes on FT8 on 15 and 17 meters, I've gotten South Africa, Algeria, Spain, Malta, France, Netherlands, and San Marino out of where is that? Just Italy?
Italy, yeah.
Yeah. And the bands are wide open.
Oh, that's pretty good. Sitting there multitasking. That's good.
Yeah. And that's with just a 43-foot radial with no ground radials, just 6 10-foot radials on the pole.
I'm going to stop the recording. You're free to stay on. I think the meeting is set up for another 10 minutes. I think they end themselves after the 2 hours, but I'm going to stop recording.